2000 AD Thrillcast Supplemental, Barrie Tomlinson, Part 2. Hello chums, and welcome to the second part of our chat with comics editor Barrie Tomlinson. If you've not listened to episode 1, head back now and acquaint yourself with his insights into the lost world of British comics for the 1970s and 80s, and then zip right back here to listen to more from one of the most influential editors of the period. As I'm sure you're aware, 2000 AD has brought back so much of the archive from IPC and Fleetway titles, including Roy the Rovers, Whizzer and Chip, Scream, and so many more. So it's fascinating to get some of the insight behind these amazing stories. And in this episode, we talked to Barrie about creating a horror comic that wasn't too scary, reviving Dan Dare for a second time, overseeing the decline of Battle and the rise of 2000 AD, and then going freelance. I'm curious at the time how these things work, because you're the editor. You're doing these publicity stunts. You're making these things happen. You're contacting celebrities. How were comics advertised at the time?
One of the reasons I first decided to get lots of publicity for the comics because they weren't advertised. When I first became an editor, I went to the management and said, look, can't we use this sort of advert? Can't we do this? And there was no budget for advertising. So that's when I made the conscious decision that I would get publicity and I would get free publicity.
And I mean, did you ever quantify the kind of value of being that the face of the publication and getting these people in?
No, I think that the publicity schemes work really well. You know, for when, for example, going back to Roy again, when Roy was shot and he was in a coma in hospital, and we asked Sir Alf Ramsey to be manager of Manchester Rovers. And Manchester won a game by 14 goals to 0. And in the storyline, we played the sound of the crowd cheering into Roy's hospital ward, and that got him out of a coma. So that sort of thing, a storyline like that, produced masses of publicity. And the more people read it, the more they want to go out and buy the publication. But we were getting advertising for free.
What sort of circulation did Roy enjoy at his height?
It probably started off about 300,000, I should think.
Okay, and when you did these, when you had storylines like him being shot, did you actively see a blip in sales?
I didn't actually see it as such because we were part of a very big organisation.
Sure.
And the people that did the print orders wouldn't necessarily be tuned into what we were doing. But the important thing was to create a demand for it. So if people went to a newsagent and it was sold out, then the newsagent would order more copies.
Oh, that's interesting. I suppose it's the case in any huge organisation that what you're doing on the front line isn't necessarily, immediately connected to the people who are controlling the supply at the printing end.
Yes, editorial people always moan about print orders, that they're cut too much. There was a habit that all the circulation would be cut maybe by 1,000 copies a week. And this happened on all the titles. And it seemed a terrible thing to the editorial people that this should happen. For example, if you did a free gift issue, when you'd put on maybe 7,000 or 8,000 for the free gift issue, that the printer would be cut the next week before anyone had a chance to work out what the demand was for that title.
That seems crazy.
It seemed crazy to us editorially, but I'm sure if you had someone from the department which dealt with that, they'd come up with a very good reason.
You're doing Roy the Rovers. When did you eventually become group editor for these titles?
I was group editor of Tiger and Roy the Rovers. Then I was asked to produce the new football magazine, which was going to be called Top Soccer. And I worked on the dummy for that and put together a lot of what I thought were very good ideas for it. But just before it was due to go to the printer, I was called into the management and told that there'd been a change of plan and I wouldn't be responsible for Top Soccer. So it was taken away from me and put into the shoot group and produced from there. So I was a bit despondent, to say the least, that I'd lost that title after working so hard on it before it even came out. And I think as compensation at that time, I was offered, well, not offered, I was given Battle and 2000 AD to be part of my group. I was still moaning away, but I was told, you've got nothing to complain about, you've now got an empire.
So Roy the Rovers was not part of the team that were producing the football magazines.
No, the shoot group was really just factual stuff. They didn't do any fictitious stories.
Okay. And with I mean, Top Soccer didn't last very long at all. I mean, that must have been doubly harsh because you had such plans for it, and it ended up being such different.
It was quite good, really, because I could say, "Oh, if I'd have done that, it would be done my way. It would have lasted longer than that." So that's quite satisfying.
Well, let's talk about Battle. I mean, it'd been going since 1975, and you inherited it in 1977 and the editor was Terry McGee. Now, this was after what many people would consider to be its peak, when it, along with Action, were busy changing the landscape of British comics. What was the state of Battle when it came into your little empire?
My new empire. The circulation was suffering a bit. It had some really good stories. I mean, the Charlie's War story was probably the best thing that's ever appeared in children's comics. Brilliantly written by Pat Mills and drawn by Joe Colquhoun. Charlie's War, absolute unbeatable, I think, as a story. And there are lots of other stories in Battle which were like Darkish War and so on, which were all very, very good indeed. But by the time I took it over, it was starting to struggle. And we had to try and keep the circulation going for as long as we could. Then, of course, Action Force was part of Battle. But then there was a change of ownership on Action Force, and that was taken out of the title. So I decided that we would have our own organisation, which I called Storm Force. And I worked very closely with Richard Burton to form Storm Force and to work out all the characters in that story. So eventually Battle became Battle and Storm Force. And that lasted a couple of years. And I think we did invent some good characters for that.
Well, with Action Force, I mean, that was a TV show tie-in that lasted, I think about 3 years. Was this to a certain extent a sign of things to come for comics? Because it was around about this time that Marvel UK started up its franchise comics. So you had things like Transformers and Care Bears, and whenever there was a new Saturday morning cartoon, then there'd be a new comic book appearing. Do you think this was for all of its success with Battle? Do you think it was also a sign of things to come, a kind of harbinger of the end of comics as we knew them?
I think possibly it was a danger to comics if they just carried on as they were, but to do tie-ups with toy lines, that worked very well. For example, when I launched Teenage Mutant Hero Turtles in 1990, that achieved a massive circulation. Was extremely popular and made a lot of money for the company.
Well, I mean, the circulation on that was like 800,000 copies a week.
Yeah, yes, we were struggling to get to 1 million, but we almost got there. Yes, that was good, based on a very successful product, and we showed that we could produce a British comic based on that, which was successful.
And obviously quite different from the original comics that inspired the TV show in the first place?
Yes. First of all, we printed the American version of the comic, then produced our own version. And I think to produce it in what I can only call the British way proved to be popular with the British readership, which is why it got this vast circulation.
And that kind of late 80s, early 90s period, you worked on quite a few tie-in comics, because you had Mask in 86, Supernatural 87, Ring Raiders in 1989, and even the Toxic Crusaders. This suggests that you were happy to adapt to the changing tastes of the readers.
It was a big job to learn each toy line and the storylines for the toys. Not only me, but the artists and the writers had to learn all the characters as well and capture the essence of the storylines. But yes, we got used to doing that, and we proved that we could do it, and it worked very well on most of the things. But Toxic Crusaders, which followed the Turtles, we thought would be equally successful, but it didn't make it, and only had a very short life.
Let's go back to your time on overseeing Battle. Now, as I said, this was a period after you'd had the controversy about action and strips like Kids Rule OK and some of the more kind of hyper violent strips that had come in with Pat Mills, John Wagner's way of doing things. What was the general culture of the time like following the demise of action? Did you have to watch yourselves in terms of violence in comics?
Yes, but the management was very cautious about that and kept a close eye on things. I mean, I was lucky at that time that all the publications I was doing before I took over Battle in 2000 was the fact that they were all family buyers, and we didn't have that sort of violent aspect to any of the storylines.
What did you think about when Battle and Action came along and they had that violence in them? What did you think about it?
Well, I was quite happy with it. If we were providing a product which people wanted to read, then that was fine with me. You'd have to keep a close eye on things and not go too far. But I think it was working very well in Battle, and I didn't want to interfere with anything that was there.
I remember there was a story about the Falklands War called Invasion, which...
Yeah, that was one of my ideas, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, that was John Wagner and Jim Watson, and that appeared very quickly after the end of the Falklands War. Did you catch any criticism for how swiftly you got that in print?
Yes, there was a bit of criticism about it from various people, and a fair point, I think, but we presented the story in such a way that we didn't want to upset anybody, and I think the way we did it worked very well, and having a very experienced writer on the story, I think that worked very well.
I mean, what was your logic behind commissioning something like that when so soon after a war like the Falklands? I mean, I guess it was a very kind of patriotic time.
Yes, and I thought it was time maybe the comics moved away from World War II and updated just a bit, and this was a way of doing it.
I mean, you say it worked well, and I mean, I remember reading some comments that John Wagner made to David Bishop about the strip, and he questioned whether it had been too soon. Looking back on stuff like that, do you feel that it did move things on for a publication like Battle that had been so very focused in the early days on World War II? Did it produce the sea change you were looking for?
Certainly. I think if we'd have carried on just doing World War II stories, then we were going to get a little bit out of date, because it was a long, long time after that war finished. And I think we should just update these things as events happen.
And as you mentioned, 2000 AD came along with Battle, and this was still relatively in its infancy. Your role as managing editor, though, you were quite hands off, weren't you?
Very much so, because I had the good sense to see that here was a publication that was being well edited, well produced, and a very successful publication. So I saw no reason really to interfere at all in it. All I did was look at the page proofs once a week and look at all the covers before they went to the printer. I'm not sure if I gave marks out of 10 for it, as has been suggested, but I can't remember doing that. But what a good idea if I did.
Well, it's funny. I was reading through your various books that you've written, and you mentioned something. I think you possibly brought in on Eagle, which was people sending in their nominations for their favourite teacher. And it kind of, I don't know, it struck a chord with what Steve McManus said about the scores out of 10. Whether they happened or not, I don't know. But there was, I got a sense of an almost, I don't know, teacher-like attitude towards readership, that you respond to them, but at the same time you're there to guide them and educate them. And you look at the stuff you did on Roy with giving the kids good lessons. Do you see did you see your role as editor, managing editor, as being almost a teacher-like guiding hand?
Well, I think that, for example, the Glamorous Teacher nomination, which was in Eagle, people raised eyebrows at that. They thought that was a little bit on the naughty side at that time. Some people did. And a bit sexist. They'd say now it was sexist. But once again, the readers really enjoyed nominating their teacher. Of course, it meant the teacher got a box of chocolates and a bunch of flowers. And some of the lads, they'd all be in love with their Glamorous Teacher. So to be able to nominate them in Eagle went down very well indeed. And as far as the marks out of 10 is concerned, we did introduce that feature in Eagle, in Tiger and Roy the Rovers, that at the end of each story, there'd be a little box, and it says, my marks out of 10 for this story. And the reader would be able to write in his own score for that story, which they enjoy doing, because their stuff they provided for the teacher was marks out of 10. So it gave them an opportunity to give their marks out of 10 for things, and they seem to enjoy doing that.
I wonder if this is where Steve got the idea that they were graded as such. It
might have been. I can't recall ever doing that, but I might have said, 10 out of 10 for that story.
What was your attitude to it? I mean, you say it was well run, everything was fine as far as you were concerned. 2000 AD had that very kind of iconoclastic, people call it punky attitude, where they were shaking things up in the tradition of something like Action, but with a sci-fi bent. As somebody who'd mostly done sports comics up to this point, what was it like coming on to having oversight on this slight wild child that was pretty much all science fiction?
It was interesting. Maybe there were times when I had to grit my teeth, but I was determined not to do any interference on the editorial contents or the way it was produced, because that was absolutely top class, and I could recognise it was like that. It would have been totally wrong for me to do any sort of interference. Mind you, later on, when I produced Scream, that maybe the 2000 AD was a nice lesson for me on how to produce stories for Scream. But that's another story, but that was a very difficult title to produce.
I wanted to ask about the period, specifically when Action came to national attention, because you had questions in Parliament, you had a tabloid, a newspaper campaign aimed at getting it taken off the shelves. Do you remember that period and the reaction within Fleetway to what was happening with Action, even though you weren't on that specific title?
No, I didn't work on it at all. Wasn't involved with it. Obviously, I was aware that there was a reaction within Fleetway to what had happened in Action, and I suppose every editor was slightly more cautious what they published after that. We had no direct instructions on what we should do. I think it became a question of using your common sense to see what could be published and what couldn't.
Was there a feeling of this will blow over?
Yes, I think there was. I mean, 2000 AD was a publication which broke all sorts of barriers, created all sorts of things which other comics had not tried. And I was certainly aware that there was a revolution going on 2000 AD, and that contributors were getting a status and a strength that they never had before. And I was obviously aware of that, though I was never involved in it. And I was vaguely aware of various confrontations between Steve McManus and his contributors and the management. But as I say, it was nothing I got involved with, but I think what they achieved in 2018 was magnificent, and it was great, not only for the editorial staff, but for all the contributors.
As somebody who'd been at IPC since the early 60s, so you had a kind of one foot in the tradition of comics that were being published at the time. But you were also, looking ahead, creating new products, seeing this revolution taking place. How much did the internals of the internal structure, the internal ethos of the company, how was that changed by Action in 2000 AD, or did things continue much as they had, and people just kind of looked at this new thing that was happening off to one side?
Yes, I wasn't aware of any major change taking place. We certainly had no instructions on how we should behave. But as I say, there was a revolution going on from 2000 AD, and very successfully. But on my group of titles, which I know included 2000 AD, but on the other more established titles, there was also a revolution going on. I mean, I set out to increase the status of the comics, and I think I succeeded in that. And comics were no longer the poor relation at IPC magazines. My comics were extensively featured in the media, and they began to have a status of their own. I think prior to that, comic bashing had become something of a habit in the media, but that gradually stopped as people seemed to get more respect for the comics and what we were doing.
I mean, we've talked a bit about the difficulties you had with Scream, for example. When you say that there was more respect for comics within the company, how did that filter through to you? Was it to do with more freedom, or just in how people were talking to and about the work you were doing?
Yes, the relations with the media were so much better. I mean, prior to that, there were so many occasions where things in comics were sort of ripped apart by the media, and particularly by some television programs. But that stopped as we began to make regular contact with people in the media, and we got them on our side, which I think was very important.
And when you've got a title like Roy the Rovers, I mean that launched with 300,000 plus sales. I suppose it helps when things are doing well that people suddenly sit up and take notice.
Yes, I think so. If obviously we had a very good basis with Roy the Rovers, it was already very popular. But the steps we took to make Roy the Rovers much more true to life on and off the pitch, it attracted the media's attention and helped with the publicity of the title.
Okay. There was one incident that I wanted to mention, because we've talked about how you were very hands off with 2000 AD. That Steve McManus and Richard Burton as well were, as far as you were concerned, they knew what they were doing, and you left them to get on with it. But there was one cover, I believe, an Ian Gibson cover for Prog 278, where you had a slight difference of opinion about a synonym for the word fart.
I read that in Steve's book, and I thought that was quite amusing. I can't actually remember the occasion, but I always looked at the covers of 2000 AD before they went to the printer, and on the very rare occasions when I wasn't happy about something, then I would point Steve in the direction of the managing editor, and he would take the cover to the managing editor for him to make a decision. But that was a very rare thing.
Right. Okay. So you just didn't want to interfere, so you just kind of sent it upwards.
Yeah, I think one of the things of being a good group editor is you know when to interfere and when not to. And certainly when I was given 2000 AD to be part of my group, I decided there and then that I wouldn't interfere, because if it's working, don't interfere with it.
Was there ever any pressure from above on you as group editor about 2000 AD?
No, there wasn't really. I mean, I made sure that if people had any queries, then they would go to Steve with it rather than to me. I mean, I had my hands full with so many other titles, holiday specials and annuals. So I was quite happy for 2000 AD to continue on its merry way without me interfering in any way.
I wanted to ask you about when you relaunched Eagle. You obviously had Dan Dare in there, which had been running with some success in 2000 AD from 2000 AD's beginning. The storyline, however, in 2000 AD finished without a conclusion, because there were various things going on around the sort of the copyright and what the copyright holders wanted to do with him as a character. Did you face any kind of internal struggle or internal backlash, or what was the story about reclaiming Dan Dare from 2000 AD?
Well, we just did our own thing, really. We didn't refer to what had gone on in 2000 AD. We wanted a more traditional Dan Dare story. And we launched it with his great-great-grandson. But then eventually we weren't too happy with that, and we changed it to the original Dan Dare.
Right. Okay. So there was no kind of comment from the 2000 AD guys going, oh, well, we kind of wanted to keep going with him?
Not that I can remember at all. They might have spoken to Dan about it, of course, but and not to me. But I've got no recollection of it.
I was going to ask about Scream, because we recently republished Monster by Alan Moore, John Wagner, and it's gone down very well, but that Scream itself was pretty short-lived, and you had a lot of trouble with it, didn't you?
We had enormous amount of trouble, yes. When they asked me to produce it, I thought, well, this is going to be difficult. And I thought it would be difficult in the sense of the reaction we would get from people outside the industry, but it was in-house that we had all the problems. When we produced the first issue, I was very pleased with that. I thought I'd struck a balance. I didn't want it to be a horror comic, but at the same time, I wanted it to be a little bit that way. And I thought we'd got the balance just right. And I showed it to Gil Page, who was the managing editor. We were very happy with that first issue. A new system was installed that instead of going normally to the editorial director, we were pointed in the direction of another senior editorial man. And we took the first issue into him, and it was absolutely ripped to pieces. He demanded so many alterations that when we left the office, we didn't know what to do, where to start. And it took many days of doing all the corrections, and we had to sub down a lot of the storylines for reasons which we really couldn't understand. So it was a shock to us for that first issue. But when we took the second issue in, that got the same treatment, and the third issue, and so on.
Because you've been taking stuff to Gil Page, who'd been the editorial executive for other titles. Did you ever find out why you suddenly had to take it to this other person?
No, I think it was a change of system that had been introduced. It made life very, very difficult because we never really caught up with ourselves. We had to change stories and change attitudes to other stories. And because we did so many alterations that the issues got later and later, I'd always had a good reputation of getting my titles to the printer on time. But with Scream, it was getting very late. Then the strike came along, which saw titles disappear from the bookstores for a while. And of course, the management took that opportunity of making sure that Scream didn't come back. And it had a very short run, but I think it was a good publication, says he modestly. I mean, there's still websites devoted to Scream. And as you say, various parts of it have been reprinted by various companies. And it looks very good when they reprint them, I think. And they seem to, the fact that they do get reprinted shows that the storylines were pretty good.
Why do you think there was that opposition to something like Scream? Because at the very beginning, I think you comment in something I've read of yours, where it said you wanted it to be a bit frightening without being a horror comic. So you weren't going down in an old EC Comics kind of comic code busting way of doing a horror comic. Yet there seemed to be this opposition to it.
Yes, I tried to get a little bit of humour, a bit of tongue-in-cheek horror into the publication. We had cover lines saying, "Not for the nervous," and "Just when you thought it was safe to sleep with the light out." Things like that, which were fun in themselves. To try to give the idea of what the publication was about and the attitude it was taking. And we didn't get any complaints that I'm aware of from parents or readers or anybody else outside the publishing house itself. And it's a great shame it had such a short life, because I'm sure it could have continued for much longer.
Because we had Ian Rimmer on the podcast earlier this year to talk about Scream, and he mentioned that he was brought in once most of the first issue had been commissioned. I've already mentioned Monster, which Alan Moore had written the first episode for. Ian mentioned that Alan had worked up a wider plot synopsis for the series and then John and Alan took it in a different direction. Do you have any memory of where Alan had intended to take the series before he stepped away from it?
No, I'm sorry, I haven't at all. When I read something Ian wrote, that I had taken the idea away and locked it in a drawer. I've got no recollection of that at all. I'm surprised if that's what happened, because having got the storyline set up for number one, then the way it was going to go, I would have thought would have been fairly clear. But the way it did go made for a popular story.
One that survived long after Scream's demise was the 13th Floor that eventually made it into the Eagle. Was that a personal favourite?
Very much so. Yeah, I think that was a terrific story, and so popular, not only in Scream but in its later life in Eagle. Good story, well written, well drawn, and it was one of my personal favourites, I think, because it was a story that not only children could read, but grown-ups as well. And I certainly really enjoyed getting the script for that every week.
I mean, New Eagle had already been going for a couple of years by the time that Scream came along. 2000 AD had already revived Dan Dare in its pages, but then when the New Eagle came along, he switched over. What was the rationale of relaunching Eagle, which had been such a important and well-known title?
it had always been my ambition to do that. I was a reader of the original Eagle, and I was very, very impressed on how it was produced. So I always wanted to bring it back, and it was always something in the back of my mind throughout my time in the comics. And eventually, I spoke to the management on a few occasions, but eventually I reintroduced the idea to them, and they agreed that, yes, go for it. But we knew it would be difficult because so many people would compare it with the old version. And I think when we relaunched it, there were an awful lot of people who read the original one who thought we should produce all the same stories. But when you looked at the original Eagle, the only sort of items that you could carry on with in the new publication would be the Dan Dare story and the Eagle Cutaway.
Yeah.
Otherwise, we had to go with something totally new, which is why I decided that we should go with photo stories on some of the adventures rather than all picture strip, and switching to photo stories, which had been very, very popular in girls' comics, proved to be a very, very difficult job because it was in the days before computers came along. So all these special effects had to be done by hand. And sometimes it was very difficult to show a nuclear explosion and all sorts of aliens charging around in a photo strip. But we did it, and I think it worked. The story Doom Lord worked very well in photos rather than drawings.
Okay.
But after probably about 6 months or so, it became clear that the readers didn't really like the photo strips. They'd grown up in the tradition of drawn strips, and they didn't like photo stories. And I thought because they were so tuned into television, they'd welcome photos, but they didn't. So we had to switch back from photo stories to drawn stories, much to the delight of artists everywhere.
Well, you nearly came a cropper at a photo shoot in a London park, didn't you?
Yes, it was being the Doom Lord story was being photographed, and it was late at night, pitch black, and we were trying to do these photographs, but we'd chosen the rutting season, and the deers were charging around, and it was the quickest photo shoot ever, I think, that we got at that park very, very fast, with the sounds of bellowing in our ears, and the thought of Doom Lord facing a charging deer seemed a bit too much, so we cut that out and left rapidly.
Well, I mean, you mentioned how popular the photo strips had been in girls' comics. Bearing in mind what you just said about the difficulties of producing them, and the fact that boys' comics had a more tradition of drawn stuff. Why do you think they just didn't take? Why were they popular in girls' comics?
Because I think the storylines were just all, I'm saying the word ordinary, but in this sense, ordinary storylines where there'd be boy talking to girl in the classroom, in the park or something. There was no special effects needed. Whereas in a boys' adventure story, there's lots of special effects. Maybe today, when you can involve computer effects, it would work much better. I think the photographers and the art side on the new Eagle produced some very good results. But at the end of the day, as I said at the start, you have to do what the reader wants.
And with something like Dan Dare, the problem you mentioned there is that the original Eagle was very, very particular. It was a very specific moment in time where reading tastes were different. 2000 AD overcame that by making Dare they called him a hyper hero, so a lot more violent, a bit more ruthless, and with the incredible artwork by Ballard Nelly and Dave Gibbons. What approach did you take to overcome that problem with such a well-known character like Dare?
Well, we brought in Dan's great-great-grandson as the hero of the story, a new Dan Dare. That worked to some extent, but eventually we decided to go back to the original Dan, which we did. Brought in Digby and Professor Peabody from the original story, at which point I thought, well, let's have a romance between Dan and Professor Peabody. I could do a Roy the Rovers with this. But alas, I never had time to do that.
Let's talk about the actual launch of the new Eagle, because I mean, 1982. It's bringing back the name of this venerable institution from the 50s. But you put on a proper lavish launch event.
Yes, I was very lucky that the management okayed me to do a launch, which cost a lot of money. I think the publicity we got from that more than made up for the money we spent on the launch. I hired the Waldorf Hotel, and we had the most wonderful launch. We had this large ballroom type place where we did the launch, and there was a screen halfway across. And we had the Mekong appearing on the screen, screaming insults to Dan Dare. Then Dan Dare rushing on and lasering the Mekong, who disappeared in a great scream. One of the artist agents' son did look a little bit like Dan Dare, so we just trimmed his eyebrows a little bit. Found a uniform which looked vaguely like Dan Dare, and got the toy laser gun that my son owned and borrowed that. That's what used to shoot the Mekong on the screen. And once the Mekong disappeared, there was a sound of an engine, and a minivan burst through the screen with Big Daddy sitting on the bonnet, holding the first copies of Eagle, which everybody pounced on. There was a great fanfare of trumpets at that time from the trumpeters of the Royal Artillery, and Big Daddy was there dishing out the first copies, which people were really eager to see, and a lot of them were just waiting to have a go at it, to say this nowhere near as good as the original. But we got a reasonably good press, I think, from that first issue.
I mean, just the thought of the budget for something like that nowadays is making me sweat, to be honest with you. But I guess with your background in attracting people, famous people to do comics, it kind of makes sense to do something like that. I guess we're back to that chutzpah, aren't we? That there's no harm in trying kind of thing.
No, quite so. If you can do it, as I say, it costs a lot of money. But the publicity we got on television, newspapers, on the radio, more than made up for that. It was a massive publicity campaign.
And I mean, Eagle was getting 350,000 copies a week, which even compared to 2000 AD at the time was excellent. Where did you see Eagle going? How did you see it evolving over time? Because that you had that initial hurdle to overcome with using the original name. How did you want it to develop as a comic in competition to comics like 2000 AD and the other titles in your stable?
Well, I wanted it to obviously have a character of its own, but capture the essence of the original Eagle by combining features and good picture stories. And I signed up some big names to write for Eagle every week. Mike Reed, who was doing his own Radio 2 program at that time and was very popular with the readership, and he was a great fan of the comics. So it was a good tie-up for us because he would publicise the Eagle on his program and have a regular column in it. And we signed Barrie Tomlinson, who just won a gold medal. Big name. So it was good to tie up big names like that. But suddenly I was called in and told, stop this, you're bringing in too many famous people, drop all the big names from Eagle, which we had to do virtually overnight.
Why was that?
At the time I was told I was too staff-struck. But it was a bit late for that. It happened successfully in all the other titles. But why they suddenly decided that should be the case, I don't know. But I had to do as I was told, and those big names disappeared, and it affected, I think, the balance of the publication. But otherwise, we tried to carry on with the essence of the original Eagle, obviously with Dan Dare as the main character, but carrying on with the centre spread, cutaway drawings and things. And it lasted 12 years at the end of the day, and that's not a bad run in that era when comics were starting to struggle.
No, absolutely. I mean, were there any projects that you worked up that didn't get beyond the dummy stage that you think Fleetway should have tried, especially given the success of 2000 AD and New Eagle?
We did a comic called Wildcat, which didn't have a very long life, and that was really produced at the time when comics were struggling enormously. But Wildcat we launched October 1988 and ran to March 89. And into Wildcat, I thought I brought everything I'd learned from all my time and all the other comics. And we had very good contributors, very, very good writers, very good artists, very good reproduction. But that didn't work. And I think it wasn't the same as 2000 AD by any means, but it was slightly different from the normal one of the comics.
Do you think a title like New Eagle, which is and Wildcats, which are where you're producing original content that stands on its own, there's no tie-ins or anything like that. Do you think they found it difficult to compete against things that had the TV tie-ins, like Teenage Mutant Hero Turtles and Toxic Avengers and all the others? Yes.
I mean, that television was such an important part of a child's life, and if you couldn't tie in with television, I think you were struggling. And that was probably one of the reasons. I think you've hit one of the reasons why these sort of things didn't have a long run.
Okay. I mean, eventually, you went freelance.
Yes, I put a proposition to the management that I could take most of my titles out on the freelance basis for my own company, take my editors with me as well as freelancers, and produce the comics from our homes. And it would save the management an enormous amount of money on office costs, telephone calls, stationery, whatever. And I put it to the management, and they agreed that it would save a lot of money, and I got to go ahead to do it. And it worked very well for probably 18 months to 2 years. But then a new management team came in, and they didn't want comics produced outside. They wanted it produced in-house. So one by one, the comics were taken away from me. And unfortunately, I hadn't been sensible enough to get a contract. So I could just sit back. They were taken back, and Roy the Rovers was taken away from me. Eagle was taken away. And it was all gone suddenly. But fortunately for me, at the same time as that happened, the Daily Mirror approached me and said, "We love the Roy the Rovers that you did. Could you do a football story for us?" So I started writing a football strip for the Mirror in 1989, and that was 6 days a week, and that lasted 22 years.
Good God.
We did 6,000 episodes of a story called Scorer, which was a football hero. So it was part football, part glamour, featuring all the girlfriends in his life. And as I say, that lasted 22 years. So it was nice to be able to switch to that after losing the comics.
Yeah. When the final comic was taken away from you, did you look back on your time working at Fleetway and go, well, that was a waste of time? Or was there still that sense of pride that you had in what you'd achieved?
Oh, yes. I think I was very lucky to work on the comics when they were so popular. And it was a job I really enjoyed doing. And it's great that people still remember, and I still get lots of emails and lots of letters from people who are interested in what we produced. And it's great to see so many websites devoted to those comics.
Do you think to a certain extent you were kind of lucky to get out when you did? Because obviously the 90s were a very difficult time for comics of all types.
Yeah, I could always say it wasn't me that killed off Roy the Rovers, can't I? I think I was in a way. It was good that I could go onto the newspaper strip for 22 years, so that kept me occupied. And in that newspaper strip, I could use a lot of the techniques that I'd learned on the comics. Of course, not only did I enjoy editing, I liked writing scripts as well.
Okay. And as managing editor of a group that included 2000 AD and Battle and all these other comics, do you feel that you've contributed to, by being hands off? Do you feel like you've contributed to the success of 2000 AD by letting it be its own thing?
That's a very difficult question, really, because it is so successful. And at the time I was there, Steve McManus was doing such a great job. I think if I'd have moved in heavy-handed, then that would have been totally wrong and it would have harmed the publication. So best left alone and concentrate on other things.
One thing I was curious about in The Mighty One, which is Steve's autobiography, there's some wonderful pictures of him in his action man poses, where he goes off and does things like stilt walking and training with the army. I always felt as if that was kind of like a natural extension of yourself being at the forefront of the titles that you edited at the time. So, you talked about that connection between readers as an editor, and Steve kind of took it to another extreme with action.
Yes, I'm very impressed with the photographs. I mean, gosh, with a tin helmet on and a gun in his hand and bullets around his neck, very impressive indeed. I'm afraid I haven't got any of that in my books.
One thing I did want to ask about was about creator credits, because it was something that kind of came in while you were working at Fleetway, and you talk so warmly about the creative teams that you work with on things like Tiger and Lion. Did you make any efforts yourself to try and get the companies to give the recognition to the creative teams on strips?
No, I gave credits right at the end on the later titles that I produced. But it was great that 2000 AD started doing that, and it was good that the contributors should get credit for the work that they did. And also, I think it's interesting for readers to see who produced the work. And so that was something that 2000 AD achieved, and I think that's something that they should be congratulated on, because that was very good and something that we did eventually in my group, but not to the very end.
Okay. Was that a conscious choice on your part, or was it just that's the way things have always been done, and eventually you just saw the way that the wind was kind of blowing?
Yeah, I mean, when I inherited these titles, it was the way it had always been done, to such an extent that when we had a script in with the author's name typed at the top, we had to cut it off before we sent it to the artist.
Wow. Okay.
It sounds absolutely extraordinary, but that was the system that was operating when I first joined the company.
Okay. And we've just acquired the Fleetway IPC Youth Group archive at 2000 AD, which includes things like Roy the Rovers. As somebody who's worked with the creators on these titles, how do you feel about these creators getting the recognition in the future that they deserve, that they didn't necessarily get at the time?
They may not have got it at the time, but certainly today, with all the internet sites, everybody is aware of who wrote what and who drew what. And I think it's really good that the contributors on the comics are getting the credit they deserve, because in my time, I think we had some magnificent artists and writers working on the comics, and they should get credit for what they did, because they were absolute legends in their own time.
You provided us with a draft of another book that you've written called It's Only a Comic, which is something you were told very early on in your career as a way of chastising you, I believe.
When I I first became editor, I went into the managing editor's office with lots and lots of ideas for Tiger. And the managing editor listened to them all. And he paused and said, "Remember this, it's only a comic." And I thought, well, perhaps that's the attitude to comics which needs to change. They're not only comics, they're something rather special.
And looking back on your career now, you've obviously got an awful lot of affection for it because, I mean, you've written an entire book about your time with all the Rovers and all the celebrities you got to meet and all this and other. What's been your overriding ethos in how you've done your job?
Well, I hope I've done it. I produce publications which people wanted to read. I think, as I say, it's the reader that guides things. And if you can produce publications that children like, then that is all you need.
And I mean, I guess it's the $64 million question these days is how would you, as an editor, tempt back children to comics? Because obviously, times have changed. Comics are much more of a niche product than they used to be. The newsstand is declining. If Fleetway came to 25-year-old Barrie Tomlinson and said, "How do we reverse this decline?" what do you think you would do?
Well, I think it's interesting that football is more popular now than it's ever been. The Premier League has a massive following all over the world. So when you talk of football, when you talk of the Premier League, you talk of Roy the Rovers. So I don't think Roy the Rovers should be a character of the past. I think it should be a character of the present or the future. Because Roy the Rovers is football, and football is massively popular. So I think a publication should make use of that popularity by reintroducing a character like Roy the Rovers. And I'm sure now, with new copyright holders of Roy the Rovers, the future looks really good for the character. And Real Roy the Rovers stuff, my new book, is a perfect present for all those people that used to read Roy the Rovers, who are now dads, granddads, and great-granddads. They really would enjoy it as a present.
Thank you so much for taking the time to chat to me. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Very enjoyable. Thank you. Good talking to you.
No worries. And no doubt talk to you again soon in the future. Well, we hope you enjoyed that, Earthlets. An absolutely fascinating couple of episodes from Barrie about his life and work. A huge thank you to him for being so generous with his time. We'll see you in 2017. We've got some amazing guests lined up for the next couple of episodes. So until then, have a very happy new year and splundig verthrig.